Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 22nd issue of Chebacco Chats. Really happy to have with us today Will Thorndike. Will is a longtime friend of the Historical Society, leader in many positions on Mount Desert Island and elsewhere, and to me personally, one of the early proponents of Chebacco. I first learned of Chebacco from you, Will, about 10 or 11 years ago, before I became aware that this was a publication. But I'm really glad that you've joined us to talk about your article, Three Buildings, the Iconoclastic Robert W. Patterson. And let me just get our slides set up here, which will take just a minute. Here we go. And I hope you're looking at the cover slide. Is that right?
Yes, I am, Tim.
Sounds good. So welcome, Will. Let's get started.
Thanks, Tim. Nice to be here.
So I should mention that you're an author in other respects. You are the author of a book titled The Outsiders, which has been translated into 10 languages and attracted, I'm sure in many other places, but at the Jessup Library, a standing room only audience. And I was in the balcony for that. So you're a good writer, and it shows in your article that you've written for Chebacco. This appeared in the 2014 issue, one that bore the theme Against the Tide, Outliers and Controversies. And that's how the iconoclastic Robert W. Patterson fits in here. Will, why don't you begin by reading a selection from your article?
Okay. Thank you, Tim. Again, it's nice to be here. And maybe what would be useful is to just read. I'll just quickly read a little bit about Bob Patterson's background. So Robert Patterson was born in 1905 in Wayland, Massachusetts, then a largely rural community about 10 miles west of Boston. The family property was located near the town lines with Lincoln and Concord and set on 60 acres of woodland. According to the Harvard University Archives, Patterson graduated from Harvard College in 1927 and in 1932 received a master's degree in landscape design. In 1931, he married Barbara Brown, a talented ornithologist and also a Wayland native. And in January of 1934, Patterson, Barbara, and their daughter moved to Mount Desert, drove there in a blizzard, and were attracted by the prospect of design work with the Civilian Conservation Corps, something we'll probably get into in more detail. And I'll stop there, Tim.
Okay, and one of the things that you set out at the very beginning of your article is that you point out that in the wake of the 1947 fire, a starkly different architecture emerged on MDI. And you point to three of Patterson's buildings, the Bar Harbor Yacht Club, Garland Farm, and the Abbe Museum addition, the one at Sur-de-Mont. And you demonstrate how this pivot in architectural style played out in the decades following the fire. But before we have you talk us through that, why don't you set the context of MDI's architecture? What was it like before the fire of 47 and the decades previous to that?
Yeah, so of course, Mount Desert has an extraordinarily rich and varied architectural history. This slide shows Redwood, which was designed by William Ralph Emerson, and is sort of famously the first shingle-style cottage designed house in the United States, sort of a touchstone in American architecture. It was built here in 1879 and sort of began a period of extraordinary architectural creativity on the island that began in 1879, 1880, and really continued until the onset of the Depression in 1930. And over that period of time, around 200 summer cottages were built by a variety of architects who came from all over the world, including world-renowned designers like Bruce Price, who designed Turrets, which is now at the center of the COA campus.
And you really give us some pretty interesting descriptions of these buildings, what were their characteristics? What are the fundamental characteristics of the shingle style of architecture?
Well, the shingle style sort of evolved out of the arts and craft philosophy in England, and the styles evolved over that 50-year window of time, sort of out of arts and crafts with its attention to natural materials and craftsmen building different components of the designs and so forth, to increasingly ornate structures as time went on, particularly in sort of the first quarter of the 20th century. The summer cottages that were built after that point were substantially more elaborate and ornate, and included sort of a polyglot mix of different architectural styles, ranging from Stratford-on-Avon Tudor to Italianate palazzo, often in the same structure. So the cohesion of some of these early designs, like redwood, began to give way to a much more varied, mix of styles as the period went along. But all of them very ornate.
And I think you cite Wingwood as a place where many architectural styles collide. So tell us about Wingwood. What was going on there? What might we observe even in this postcard image of it?
Wingwood was owned by a Philadelphia banker named E.T. Stotesbury, and it was the purchase of an older arts and crafts shingle style cottage that was then subject to a quote unquote substantial remodeling, resulting in the structure you see here. And this structure included 80 rooms, 28 bathrooms, 26 handcrafted marble fireplaces, and most uniquely at the time, 52 telephones. The telephone still being relatively new. So this was a rambling, gigantic structure, sort of this was the McMansion of its day, but on a much broader, much larger scale.
Will, a couple of years later, Rick Savage wrote a story about the home his father built in the Astiku area of Northeast Harbor. And he said many of the materials came from the demolished Stotesbury estate. So it lived on in the vernacular as well. So what would account for the proliferation of these large cottages here and this particular style of architecture? What were the economic circumstances that led to these enormous estates thriving in late 19th and early 20th century?
Yeah, I think, Bar Harbor took its place alongside of Newport and Lenox, Mass, and Saratoga as sort of a Gilded Age, one of the premier Gilded Age resorts. And so it benefited from the extraordinary growth in the economy that took place in that period, sort of the late 19th century into the first quarter of the 20th century. Most of that was a period when there were no income taxes. And so like the mansions in Newport, the cottages up here were a product of that same era. Many of the same designers were involved, designing, many of the same architects were involved in designing houses and public buildings in all of those locations.
Okay, so you have this enormous movement. You say 200 cottages built on Mount Desert Island, but not one gets rebuilt, and it all comes crashing to an end. And what caused the boom in cottage building to stop?
You sort of had the confluence, Tim, of three things. First of all, you had the Great Depression, right? And basically after 1931, only 2 new cottages were constructed. So the boom came to a very rapid halt with the onset of the Depression, which was, of course, then followed by World War II. And sort of the very lively summer life that existed here through the 20s sort of withered and came to a very abrupt halt with the confluence of those two things. And then, of course, 2 years after the end of World War II, you had the Great Fire that decimated Bar Harbor and so much of the surrounding area. And following the fire, virtually none of the original cottages that were damaged in the fire were rebuilt. So in sort of a 16, 17-year period, you went from peak activity, very frothy activity, to virtually, a complete halt, all in a very short, very, very abrupt period of time.
So,
Yeah, and I think actually, Tim, there's an analogy with.
were they not in?
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you complete your thought.
I was just going to say,
I was going to shift direction a little bit.
A little bit of an analogy with, say, Pompeii, also a resort town where the abruptness, the suddenness of the decline has fed the fascination with that heyday in the years since, and also the ability to spot vestiges of it around town. So it's sort of a unique dialogue with the past here in Bar Harbor and more broadly on the island and with its architecture.
Very much so. I know in Chebacco and some of our writing, we've occasionally touched on this age, but since it's all covered so thoroughly in many other settings, we've tended to drift away from it. So it's good to have you here to kind of reorient us towards this era of cottage building. One thing I don't understand, though, is like Pompeii was buried in ash, so the fact that it wasn't rebuilt is understandable. Here, was there not insurance? Was there not sufficient wealth to, or was the fire almost a relief to the generations that now had these responsibility for these large cottages? What were some of what were the factors that, okay, a fire burned it down, but why not rebuild? Why was there not an impetus to just put them right back up again, bigger and grander than ever?
Yeah, I think part of it was, a dramatic change in economic circumstances for the wealthiest sector of society following the Depression. And there was no immediate rebound from that until long after World War II and the fire. So I think that's the primary circumstance. Relatedly, the sort of active summer life that had been such a draw, withered very quickly as those various forces were unfolding. So I don't think there was the same draw that there had been before.
Okay, so this world changes completely, and there's a new era, and in comes Robert W. Patterson. So tell us about him. Give us his. You've kind of introduced his life, but how did he get introduced to the island as an architect and as a designer?
Yeah. So Bob Patterson, as I said, is trained at gets a landscape architecture degree at Harvard from what would now be the Graduate School of Design. And very shortly after getting that degree in 1932, he moves up here with his family to go work for the CCC, which was then based in Ellsworth and doing lots of projects in Acadia National Park. And the first projects he's involved with up here is he gets hired as a trail designer on the western side of the island, where they're building some of the signature trails today on the western side of the island in Acadia. And he specifically designs two landmark trails on the western side of the island, the Perpendicular Trail and the Beach Cliffs Trail. And as he begins to get involved with the CCC, he falls under the influence of Beatrix Farron, the world-renowned landscape architect, and the head architect at the park for Acadia, Benjamin Breeze. He begins to do projects with the two of them. And after the fire, he opens his own practice in the old YMCA building, now the Abbe Museum in downtown Bar Harbor. And he begins to build his practice and build structures around the town, both residential structures and public buildings.
And one thing you note is that he had no staff, virtually no staff. Yet, yeah. As you'll explain to us, he's tremendously prolific. So does that give us some insight into what kind of man he was?
Yeah, he had occasional draftsmen who worked with him, Tim, but he generally did the drawings himself. He was very hands-on with that. And the fire, of course, was a boon to his practice. So following the fire, in the following 3 decades, he designed 60 houses, roughly 2/3 of them on MDI, the others elsewhere in Maine, and one in Massachusetts and one in Connecticut. and then a bunch of additions to other existing structures, and then a bunch of public buildings. And being a small town architect, he was involved in a wide variety of projects, sort of a jack of all trades. So if you look at his project lists, it includes, a church steeple in Blue Hill, a doghouse in Manset, a dock, and then lots of, museums, libraries, that kind of thing. And he had a very illustrious clientele, lots of the, the famous, families that have been involved in the island for so long, starting with the Rockefellers, were repeat clients for Bob Patterson over a very long period of time. And he built a very successful practice here in the years after the fire.
Wow. So one thing you point out is that he was very engaged with landscape design, and his training was different from that of most architects because of the way he integrated landscape design. And here is an image of the perpendicular trail. And I have to point to an article by Jack Russell that appeared in the Friends of Acadia journal years back, that I'd been climbing the perpendicular trail many times, but it had never really occurred to me that this is a designed structure. And the two trails that he designed, the Echo Cliffs Trail and the perpendicular trail, they are some of the hairiest climbs there are in Acadia National Park. Tell us about his life as a landscape designer and how that influenced his life as an architect.
Yeah, so it's a key point, Tim. He's trained as a landscape architect first, which is very unusual. And these two trails are masterpieces of that. I mean, the trail craft is amazing. You can see it in the staircase here, how closely the trails fit the topography, and then just how aggressive the lines he chose are, both for the perpendicular trail and for the Beach Cliffs Trail. But that landscape design background affected his architecture very dramatically. So all of his structures are extraordinary for their siting, for the way they're chosen to blend into the existing site, but also to optimize the views from that site. So those are trademark characteristics of his built work. But landscape architecture was central. He continued to design gardens and properties throughout his career, and he was instrumental in initiating a certification process for landscape architects in Maine, and he held license number 1 himself. So it remained part of his practice throughout his career.
Where would we see some of his landscape designs if we were to wander the island today?
Yeah, he designed the Fabry Memorial in Otter Creek, which is wonderful. He designed Somesville Landing in Somesville, and he designed some cemetery plots for different families. The Damrosch family plot at Ledgelawn is wonderful. And the plot he actually designed for his own family in the Somesville Cemetery is also wonderful. So those would be a few examples. He also laid out the plan for Sealy Road off of Schooner Head Road in Bar Harbor. So he did a little bit of sort of urban planning, so to speak.
Yeah, and of the sites you mentioned, I'm only unfamiliar with the Damrosch family plot at Ledgelawn. I'll have to take a visit there and see.
Yeah, it's right inside the front gate on the left. It's an outdoor room framed by a pine tree and a bench. It's quite extraordinary with a view of Cadillac and Door in the background. And Walter Damrosch was he was the conductor of the New York Philharmonic, so another illustrious client.
Well, now let's start to shift over to his architecture. And I meant to say to our audience to give us your questions and comments. You have the option of commenting on Facebook Live, or if you're watching us via Zoom, you can put questions in the Q&A section or in chat. We'll get them at we'll get your comments at any of those locations. So Will, tell us about his architectural heritage. What influenced him, and how do those influences play out in his work on MDI?
Yeah. So I would describe Bob Patterson as a regional modernist. So someone who's taking the broader ideas of mid-century modernism and then applying them in a very specific geography. And there's some trademarks to his design, but to just sort of frame that, that's how I'd think about him. And what we're seeing on this slide here is the Thunder Hole Ranger Station, which was designed by Benjamin Breeze, who I mentioned earlier. He was the head architect in Acadia National Park in the early and mid 30s. And this structure is the first in the park that sort of set the neo-Acadian architectural tone of park buildings that you'll see throughout the park and different, ranger stations and rest areas and so forth. And it was built in 1933, the year before Bob Patterson and his family moved up here. So Benjamin Breeze was an influence. Patterson worked very closely with him, particularly in his early years here. He was also influenced by George Howe, who designed two wonderful houses on the island, Tide Race in Soamesville and Fortune Rock at the very top of Soame Sound. George Howe was the dean of the Yale School of Architecture. He had practiced with Louis Kahn. And he and Bob Patterson worked together during World War II in an office that designed federal housing. So he was also an important influence on Bob Patterson. And then I think in his early years, Patterson absorbed influences from where he grew up, including, again, his home was right on the town line with Concord and Lincoln. So Concord, of course, is Walden Pond, and the very simple cabin there, I think, was, a touchstone structure for Bob Patterson. And then in Lincoln, in the late 30s, you had two Bauhaus architects relocate from Germany to teach at the Harvard GSD, and they designed houses, wonderful houses. One, Walter Gropius, the Gropius House, which you can tour to this day, and then Marcel Breuer. So I think this combination of those influences, in addition to his work with Beatrix Farrens, were formative for Bob Patterson.
Now, here is a medley of Bob Patterson's work. Can you take us around the slide here and tell us what features you see with your practice eye of looking at a Bob Patterson house? In what ways can you see his style and ethic put into place here?
Yep. So again, his structures tend to be low slung, single story, with deep eaves, reflecting reflecting sort of the ability to manage snow during harsh Maine winters. And they use local materials, often local stone and woods and so forth. So if you look at this, you've got in the upper left a house in Bar Harbor that's single story. You can see the deep eaves. You can also see board and batten siding on the side of that house, which is a trademark. I think we'll return to that. In the upper right, if we're moving sort of clockwise, this is an amazing roof deck built into the back of the roof in a single story house in Hull's Cove with a view out towards the top of Frenchman's Bay. Again, you can sort of see the board and battening in and around the roof line, and then sort of clear story windows forming the back of the porch, bringing light down into the house. In the lower right, you have a guest house also in Bar Harbor, a very simple, efficient design. I happen to be sitting in that guest house during this interview, so I can attest to the efficiency of that design. But again, that would be board and batten outside. And you can also see design elements, sort of traces of other modernist influences in the thin pillars in front, which hearken to Le Corbusier and some of his early houses from the 20s. And then in the lower left, you have a pool house that Bob Patterson designed for Mrs. Vincent Astor. It's an extraordinary design. Both the house, the pool house itself, and the pool, which is in the foreground, is sort of crescent-shaped pool. And again, these are houses that blend into their surroundings seamlessly, but they're all optimized in terms of the siting and the location of the windows to get maximum benefit of the views.
Now, the building in the lower left, August Moon, strikes me as very different, or somewhat different from the others. And to what extent does that reflect a Patterson adventure, or perhaps a interaction with the owner and what the owner desired?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter, Tim, than the former. So I think Mrs. Astor wanted, an Asian influenced design. There's also a tea house that Bob Patterson designed back to the right, a Japanese, replica of a Japanese tea house. So there's an Asian influence to this that's apparent in this slide. If you approach that structure from the back, from the driveway, it's subtler. It's harder to see the Asian influence as you approach it. It would look more like some of these other structures, but from this side, it's very dramatic, and that was intentional, and that was due to the the collaboration with Mrs. Astor and her priorities.
Well, let's get to the thesis of your article. It's titled Three Buildings. It's the Bar Harbor Yacht Club, Garland Farm, and the extension to the Abbe Museum building at Sur de Mont. And the first is the Bar Harbor Yacht Club. So in what way does this building demonstrate Patterson's characteristics as an iconoclast?
Yeah, so I think it's useful in looking at these buildings to sort of think of them as challenges or problems that need to be solved. So the Bar Harbor Yacht Club was built on a very small postage stamp sized site north of the town of Bar Harbor down a very steep hill. It was basically the last site with water access in proximity to Bar Harbor when the yacht club was built in the mid 1950s. And so Patterson had a very tight site and a very limited budget. And so his solution, which you can see here, was to design a very simple structure. It's really a large single room with an oversized fireplace and chimney, shrouded in windows and pointed at the very top of Frenchman Bay. So optimizing views all around, their windows all around the backside of the building, which you cannot see, and accessed through a sliding glass door, which you can see in the foreground. Now, sliding glass doors are very common today, but they did not exist in the 1950s. So the design for that door is actually quite complicated. It's sort of a telescoping, innovative design. And the idea was to just get as much glass, and light and air as possible into the design. You can see it's low slung, it's single story, and there wasn't room for a porch, which is a sort of a trademark of yacht clubs generally. So it's an unconventional structure, and to put it in further context, it's in very close proximity to some famous former mansions / cottages. So it's quite close to East of Eden, which was designed by Guy Lowell, who also designed the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And so it's a highly unconventional structure relative to the conventions of yacht club design. And to sort of show those, to the left is a photograph, an old photograph of the Seal Harbor Yacht Club, which is of course wonderful, and itself quite understated relative to yacht club architecture. But you can see it's on a substantially larger scale and has a wonderful front porch. The Bar Harbor Yacht Club, stands in contrast to that by virtue of the site and the budget and so forth. But the inside of that room, there's built-in furniture to sort of promote sociability and conviviality. And you can see to the right-hand side, sort of those thin steel pillars, which are again, echoes of Corbusier and other modernists. The materials are all, it's local stone and local wood, and no steel and glass, which was a hallmark for some of the more technologically oriented modernists.
Then you go to Garland Farm. How does that show the pivot in architectural styles from the old days of the cottage era?
So the challenge that Bob Patterson was trying to solve here was this, Beatrix Farron was relocating from Reef Point and building a smaller house near Salisbury Cove on land owned by her former caretaker's family. She took with her some of the elements that she loved most from Reef Point, and the structure had to go between two existing 19th century structures, a house which was on the road and a barn in the back. So Patterson's design had to sort of fill in the middle of the sandwich and blend with these two existing 19th century structures, and also incorporate the elements from Garland Farm, which include the fencing at the front of the property and the balustrade along the roof line. and then a wonderful aquamarine door. And so he came up with a design that, again, was quite simple, three rooms and a mix of sort of flat and pitched roofs to blend into the existing structures. But it incorporated all of those reef point elements and included a garden in the back where Beatrix Farron could sort of spend her time during the sunny months.
That's a beautiful site, by the way, for those of you who may not have visited the Beatrix Farron, the Garland Farm and the gardens. It's a wonderful place to visit. Okay, so now we're down to the third building, originally designed by Edmund Gilchrist, the Abbe Museum at Sortimont, and Patterson was commissioned to build an extension. And how did he go about that then?
Yeah, so this was a challenge because the original Abbe Museum was designed by Gilchrist, and it's a wonderful but quite an elaborate building. It's got 14-foot high ceilings. It's octagonal. The outside, as you can see, is stucco and Spanish tile, and it's got a cupola at the top that's capped by with a decorative pineapple. So the question for Patterson is, what do you do adding onto a building like that, a unique landmark building like that? And Patterson's choice is pretty telling. He basically chose a modernist, sort of a modernist echo of that structure, a sleek wooden octagonal structure directly behind the existing abbey, with clear story windows to bring in light. And you can see he chose a cupola as well. These pictures were taken by me, by the way, so they're substantially worse than the other photographs in the slide here. So bear with me for that. But you can see he chose, this is the cupola, which is an echo of the image to the left, but without a pineapple on top. He was a bit more streamlined than that. But it was it's a modest solution, but a very elegant one. And it's so modest you can't even see it from the front. The only way you can see the addition is if you walk along the side of the building on your way to the tarn.
And then finally, Will, I think we've got a close-up of what you're talking about, this board and batten style. Tell us what these two slides show us.
Yeah, so on the left you have sort of typical board and batten construction. This is a very old and very inexpensive, very effective form of construction in which you have thin bands of wood that are used to seal the gap between vertical boards. And this is used on barns and outbuildings throughout northern New England and southern Canada. It's very, very common. You can see examples of it all over the island. And Patterson's innovation was to take that form of construction and to use it in homes and public buildings, and by beveling the batten, by creating a point on the batten so that it could hold light and create contrast, and created something that was actually quite elegant, simple and elegant. And he used it very frequently on the exteriors of his houses, particularly in the 40s and 50s. He did less of that as he went along in the 60s, but it was a mainstay for him. And texture generally was very important to Bob Patterson, so it was very common for him inside of his houses to use something called comb plywood, which had a very similar texture to the board and batten outside. So yeah, that's I'm actually in a room with interior board and batten, which is unusual.
Right. Let's show folks what that looks like in a larger format. Well, Will, the half hour always goes by in a big hurry, but before you go, I want to ask you, what work of architectural history are you looking forward to? I know there's one of the works that you've mentioned to me. Tell our audience about that.
So there's a guy named Jock Heron who has a publishing company called Tide Pool, and Jock is the former owner of Tide Race, the George Howe home that I referenced earlier in Soamesville. And he is putting together a book on modernist architects on the island. And it will feature George Howe and Bob Patterson and Edward Larrabee Barnes, who designed the Haystack School and the Heckscher House on the island. So yeah, preview of coming attractions.
You know the publication date of that, or when we should expect that?
Maybe out next summer.
Very good. Well, I don't see any questions from our audience, but I do see a comment from Carl Little. He says, love this photo. I think that must have been the one with he and him, with Robert and Lee on the rock
Yeah.
camping. And Carl says, Lee was a great singer and champion of Gilbert and Sullivan productions. I didn't know that his father helped found the Natural Resources Council of Maine.
Yeah, Lee was absolutely wonderful. He passed away earlier this year, but
Yeah, and you got to know Lee a little better in the process of putting this together. I think he provided a lot of your
he did.
material. Well, Will, this has been great. I really appreciate you coming on Chebacco Chats and talking to us. I always learn something when I hear you get into some of the interests that have caught your imagination, and you really dug into this. It's been very enlightening. I appreciate you being part of it.
Thanks, Tim. Nice to be with you as always.
And folks, next week I will be presenting on the life of John Gilley. He was a soldier in the 1st Maine Cavalry Regiment. Has a very interesting story, or I hope you'll think it's interesting. I'll see you next Thursday at 4:30 on Zoom and Facebook Live. Thanks very much for being in the audience today. Take care. We'll see you next week. And Will, thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tim. Bye.